So let's dive right in. This is about how to talk to an atheist. Now, there's two types of atheists. There is the internet atheist, who gets all the attention, right? They are very loud, very boisterous, spend all of their time online complaining about how much they hate a God that allegedly does not exist. And we got this picture here, which I think represents pretty well the spirit of internet atheism or new atheism. And then you got the normal atheist. You got someone who is just disinterested. They don't like spend all their time talking about atheism, talking about theism. They just aren't all that interested. And that's the norm, right? That is the normal picture. It's not the picture that you get when you think of an atheist, because the minority is very vocal and outspoken. But how to approach these two groups is completely different. So you need to keep in mind who you're talking to. Now, if you're talking to an internet atheist, I like to call this the most boring conversation ever in the history of humanity, because it always boils down to, you have no evidence. Well, what do you consider evidence? No. You tell me your best argument, and then after you tell me that argument, I get to decide if that counts as evidence. If I don't think it counts as evidence, then it doesn't count as evidence. You have no evidence. Therefore, atheism is true. I win. Ha, 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 you're a loser. Also, if they do bother to argue anything, it's probably going to be that atheism is just a lack of belief. It's not a belief system. It's just a lack of belief. It doesn't have anything to defend. I put AKA, not my dictionary, because atheism has historically always been defined as a positive position that there is no God. Now, if you just don't have any opinion, that's what we call agnosticism. We have a perfectly good term for that. But the atheist, knowing that if they have a position, i.e. there is no God, that's a positive position. That's not I don't know, that's I have a position, then they have a responsibility to defend that position. They don't want to defend that position. They want to sit there and say, I reject everything you bring, therefore I win. So they say, oh, atheism, it's just A plus theism. It's just a lack of belief. You show them the dictionary. Oh, that's not an accurate dictionary. You're just cherry-picking dictionaries or something along those lines. I did a show with a friend of mine, and we went through around 40 or 50 sources, dictionaries, academic descriptions of atheism by atheists, and they all agreed that atheism is the position that there is no God. That the internet atheist comes in and says, You're defining my position. That's so unfair. I get to tell you what I believe. So you want to change terms just so that you don't have to give an argument. Lovely. Now, if you look at a survey, you'll see only a few percent of the population actually identifies as atheist. A much larger percentage identifies as agnostic. I don't normally ever encounter anyone that just goes around talking about how much they love agnosticism, how much it is impacting their lives, how stupid anyone is for not being an agnostic. Yet, despite this lack of publicity, it's a much more common position. And that's because I think it's a more reasonable position. It's a more honest position. I don't know. I don't really care enough to find out. So then your job is not to disprove atheism necessarily, but to show why they should care. But if you're doing with the internet atheist, we'll just be brief on this kind of person so you don't waste a bunch of time on them. I demand they set the standard, right? As soon as I realize who I'm talking to, I say, fine, you want evidence? I'll be happy to provide you with evidence. You tell me what counts as evidence. Doesn't happen, right? They can't do it because as soon as they define it, the game's over. As soon as they define something, then they will be in trouble because they're not going to be able to hold to their own standard. They want to be able to set the standard after the fact, after you've made an argument. Say, oh, that doesn't count because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, you gave that good argument. Let's pretend that it's 99% certain. 99% certain? That's 1% uncertain. You haven't provided any evidence whatsoever. So make them define the standard. Or, and then additionally, David likes to say, make them prove that they're a human being, right? Hold them to their own game. Say that they have to prove that they're a real human being first. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? I'm talking to you right now. How do I know you're not a computer program? How do I know I'm not hallucinating? That kind of thing. Or you can do what I like to do, is make them defend their rationality. Make them defend that their position is reasonable. If you actually believe in your position, that you're an atheist, that you think there's definitely no God, then why in the world are you wasting your time arguing with me? If I came to the conclusion that Christianity was false, that religion was false in general, that there was no God, I would not waste another second of my life arguing about this. I would know, right, if I'm acting consistent with my own beliefs as an atheist, this is the only life I have, this very limited amount of time. Why am I spending my time arguing with people? And not only that, atheists often get mad when you say something like, there's no moral standards in atheism. And it's not an accusation against the individual. Most atheists do follow Christian moral values, generally speaking. There might be specifics where they don't, but generally speaking, they follow the same kind of values. If I was an atheist, I wouldn't, right? I would do whatever I could to get ahead. If someone else is in my way, oh well, right? It hurts someone else, oh well, I don't care. Now, I have a moral conscience. I would still feel bad about it, but I would use my rationality to override it. I would say, no, what's most important here is that I get ahead, that I get what I want. That is a logically consistent position because nothing has any meaning anyway. There is no ultimate morality. So why should I care about someone else's feelings? I only care about what benefits me. That's how I would act as an atheist. Now, again, most atheists don't act that way because they don't actually follow their beliefs to their logical conclusion. So we first want to ask the question, is atheism coherent? By this, I mean, is it internally consistent? And now there's a reason why online atheism, new atheism, centers on denial and redefinition of terms. And that's because it's very hard to bring a positive argument for atheism. People have tried. There are arguments. We'll look at a couple of those in a little bit. But for the most part, it's very hard to defend the position. If it is a positive position, if you are definitely saying, I know this is a fact, I don't just lack belief, but actually I know that there is no God, then you are required to support your position. As soon as you take a position, it doesn't matter if it's a positive position or a negative position. Any position can be rephrased to be positive or negative. What matters is that you're taking a position. You should have support. Now, there's a famous analogy by Bernard Russell, a famous atheist from years ago, that says it would be irrational to believe in a teapot floating between Earth and Mars. Right? It's very small. You wouldn't expect to be able to see it, but it'd be completely irrational to look at it. And this is kind of his analogy for what theism is. Theists say that there is a God, but they don't provide any good evidence for it. It's completely irrational to believe in it without evidence. First, the reality of the situation, where as a Christian, as a theist, I am looking at all of the evidence, or at least as much of it as I can. No one can look at everything, but I'm looking at as much evidence as I can and analyzing that evidence and seeing what is the best explanation for the available data. If we had zero evidence whatsoever, right, we knew nothing, maybe it would be reasonable to reject belief in God. But as soon as you provide one fact, it doesn't matter how weak of an argument it is. As soon as you provide one piece of evidence, that's more than the atheist has provided, and they now have the obligation to defend. So I don't care. They want to say, in the absence of any argument whatsoever, that atheism wins, fine, whatever. I don't have any interest in arguing whether or not the default position should be atheism or theism. I have an interest in deciding what the data says, what the evidence says, what is more likely to be objectively true. And it can be something as simple as my parents believed, right? It's not a great argument, but it is already a piece of evidence because your parents are generally reliable. Your parents do generally tell you true things. They probably do have good reasons to believe that. So even something as simplistic as that has already provided more evidence and made the atheist into a position where they have to provide an argument, not just assume. So I titled this slide Conditional and Bayesian Probability. So don't get scared away by the title there. Basically, I'm just saying what we need to do is we need to look at the world. So Bayesian probability, you start with the end result, and you try to back figure to what the probability would be. So what we want to do is we want to look at the world, right? We can't a priori know what the probability that God exists is. But we look at the world, we look at the data available to us, and then we say, what would a world without a God look like? What would a world with a single creator, a monotheistic religion, look like? And what would a world that had multiple competing gods, classic polytheism, look like? And we can probably reason out certain things about these different worlds. And then we can see whether our world matches up with that. I saw a comment from an atheist on probably Twitter some time ago that said, the Marvel franchise disproves God because it shows what a world would look like if God existed. Now there's, yeah, right. What? Someone said in the audience. So the idea, right, that is that there's big dramatic things happening, superpowers are being used. Now there's a bunch of bad assumptions, even under any system, because even in those worlds, most people probably don't know what's going on, right? You, the viewer, you're given an omniscient perspective. You're given the perspective where you know everything that's happening. But most of the people actually living in those worlds probably don't know about everything. But additionally, it's a classic pagan polytheistic worldview, maybe, right? Where you have multiple gods that are basically just superpowered humans. They act just like humans, but they have a lot more power, and they're battling it out. Okay, maybe our world doesn't look like that. But that has nothing to do with what a world with a single creator God would look like. So what is some of the evidence that we need to consider? Well, first of all, I exist. Now that sounds like, oh, how could that be evidence, right? But actually that tells you a lot already. Well, first of all, there's something, right? There's something, not nothing. Why should there be something? That's a question that needs answered. Additionally, I'm not just a random collection of molecules. I have a finite lifespan. I have thoughts. I have beliefs. I have desires. I have all kinds of things. Are those things consistent with the most likely scenario where there is no God? In addition to just existing, I also have free will, or at least I think I do, right? I feel like I have free will. One of the main debates that has taken place in philosophy over the years, that's given to every student in their first philosophy class, is, do you have free will, or is everything determined? And it's a really tough question for philosophy, because on the one hand, it seems intuitively obvious. Of course I have free will. I can decide exactly what I want to do. I can pick up this Quran here, and I can throw it on the floor if I want to. Or I can do all kinds of things, right? Someone tells me that I don't have free will, and I slap them in the face. I just disproved you, right? Say, no, you were predetermined to slap me in the face. Well, then why are you arguing for it? I was predetermined to argue for it. But on the other hand, if the world is just natural laws and random chance, then everything is deterministic. There's no possibility of free will. There's only that which came before, which led to what is now. You have a natural law is basically a deterministic function. You put something in, and you get the same thing out every time. There's no possibility for free will. So thus, it's a great debate in philosophy. All human societies have believed in a spiritual world. Doesn't seem like a great piece of evidence off the top of your head. I mean, they all believe different things, right? But on the other hand, it is something that needs to be accounted for. If there is no spiritual world, then why did human beings in many different societies independently, or at least somewhat independently, come up with this idea? People naturally think in terms of good and evil. Even atheist arguments against theism usually invoke terms of good and evil. But if the atheism is true, there is no absolute good, and there is no absolute evil. There's only things I like and things I dislike. And it's really hard as a human being to look at the world and say, you know, that really good thing, that really great thing, that's not actually good. I just like it. That really evil thing, especially hard with evil, right? That really evil thing that happened, that guy who murdered someone, that person who raped someone, I dislike it, but I can't say there's anything wrong with it. Now, the universe has a beginning. You can come up with several philosophical arguments for this, but I just point to the scientific consensus. Every scientist, in a relevant field, every cosmologist agrees that the universe has a beginning. Is that consistent with what you would expect from atheism? And the answer is no, because 100 years ago, before we had the definitive evidence, you ask a collection of scientists, and most of them, even if they're Christians, would say, oh, you know, that in the beginning, that's a nice fairy tale. It's a nice story, but we know the universe is eternal. It has to be eternal. That's the only way it works. And in atheism, I think it is the only way it works, which is why the multiverse is so popular in atheism. It doesn't answer anything. All it does is push the problem back. There's zero evidence for it. But hey, anything to get rid of God, right? You say that there was another universe that created this universe. And, oh, well, there was a universe before that created this universe, and so on and so forth. Natural laws exist. That we take that for granted. We know that now. But we only know about the natural laws. We only had the scientific revolution because Christians looked at the world. They believed in a God who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And they said that should manifest in the world. That you should see that. You should see an outcropping of that. You should be able to test the world and see the same result over and over again. In the ancient world, people didn't believe it. Didn't think like that. They thought that it was chaos. Now, they did do some primitive things that were kind of scientific-ish, things like trying to determine oracles and whatnot. But for the most part, they thought you couldn't determine things, right? No one could know what was going to happen when you did something because there was multiple competing gods. You don't know who's going to win out. Everything's different every day. The universe, in addition to the natural laws, there's also the fine-tuning. Natural laws already are great, right? Already something to explain. But then you have to look at the universe, and you see it's extremely, extremely, extremely fine-tuned. That when you look at the data, it looks like from the creation of the universe, everything was set up for one purpose, to have human life on planet Earth. And you do the math, and you come to these extraordinary, massive numbers, more massive than you could possibly imagine. And then you put these numbers to an atheist, and they say, I don't care. It happened. I'm here. I don't care how unlikely it is. The height of rationalism. Additionally, we find the world to be beautiful. Now, this argument is sometimes poo-pooed, right? So it's not a great argument. Oh, who cares if you think it's beautiful or not? But it's not consistent with an evolutionary perspective. Now, we might think that some things would be beautiful, right? Things that are beneficial to our survival. But our concept of beauty does not closely correspond to things that are beneficial for survival. Often we find things that are beautiful that are extremely dangerous to us. Oftentimes we find things that are extremely beneficial to us boring. And finally, a piece of evidence to consider is that the so-called national God of Israel, Yahweh, and with it the monotheistic system of Israel, which is basically unique in the ancient world, has come to dominate world thought to such a degree that this is kind of the default position. Even if you're not a theist, you think of theism in terms of the biblical God. Now, an atheist will say, well, there's lots of competing religious systems. Big deal, one won out. But one specific one won out. Pretty much the only monotheistic one. And if the biblical narrative is true, right, if there is a God, that's what we would expect. We would expect the truth to prevail. Additionally, the biblical God promises that. He says that you, Israel, are the light of the world, that the whole world will come to salvation through you. That's not a claim that other national gods are making. In the polytheistic pantheon, it was very easy to just absorb another national god into it, right? Oh, we didn't know about that God? No big deal. We'll just add him on. This God says, I am the only God. I am going to conquer the world, not through military means, but through the truth. And then it comes true. So let's look at the case for atheism. So that's the data that we need to consider. And now we need to weigh that data, see if it's consistent with atheism or not. And atheists advance several arguments. Probably the best argument, or at least the most persuasive argument, is the case for evil, the problem of evil. Classically stated, if God is all good, he should want to eliminate suffering. If he's all powerful, he should be able to. Why then do we observe suffering? And the problem of evil is a very real problem. It's something that everyone has to deal with. My wife, Crystal, is here today. She suffers from a chronic pain disorder, very debilitating illness. She couldn't make it this morning because she was in too much pain. She was crying this morning and couldn't get out of bed and felt horrific about it, that she couldn't be here for my first talk. So it's a very real thing. It's a very real problem. But here's the thing. It's not just a problem for theists. It's also a problem for atheists. Because the atheist looks at the world and they have to assume that the bad things that happen are actually evil, that there's something wrong with suffering, that there's something morally wrong with suffering. It's not just that I don't like it. It's that there's something morally wrong with it. They have to assume the truth of evil in order to prove that there's no ultimate good, that there's no God. So it's a major problem for atheists as well. On the other hand, classic polytheism offers a very easy solution. So why is this evidence for atheism exactly? In classic polytheism, the gods are battling it out. They aren't purely good. Some of them are somewhat good. Some of them are somewhat evil. And they're kind of battling it out. It's consistent, very consistent with a problem of evil. So why exactly is this evidence for atheism? I don't know. But here's the thing. Christianity has good answers for the problem of evil. They're not intuitive, right? They're not obvious. But the story of the Bible is that the world's broken, that there's something wrong with it. In John 11, when Jesus encounters Mary and Martha, and they want him to come and heal their brother Lazarus, he doesn't get there in time. Lazarus is dead, and Jesus, knowing that he's going to revive him, what does he do? He cries, he weeps, he looks at the world, he sees it's broken, he sees that there's something not right here. He's all-powerful, all-knowing, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet when he looks at the world, he sees that there's something wrong with it. This is the biblical story. And just one quick explanation for suffering from a Christian perspective. Could say a lot about this, but I like this one from John 9:1. I think there's many different causes of evil, so there's many different answers, but I like this one because it's not one we usually think of. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So suffering gives us, in context, right, it gives Jesus an opportunity to demonstrate his power. That this man, the two options, right, for that day was, if you're suffering, it's either because you sinned or because your parents or an ancestor sinned and you're suffering the consequences. He says both of those are wrong. The reason this man was born blind, the reason he's suffering, the reason he doesn't have an income is because it was for my glory. It was for the glory of God. So when we, as followers of Christ, see suffering, we have the opportunity to illuminate God's glory in this world. How? By miraculously healing someone? Well, maybe, but probably not. More likely, it's to come and stand beside them, stand with them in their suffering, take away a lot of the mental pain, even if you can't do anything about the physical pain, and thus demonstrate the love of God in this world. So finally, the strong form of the problem of evil, the one that would actually rule out theism, support atheism, is widely rejected in philosophy. It's seen as a failed argument in the academics, even among atheist philosophers. Now, the other arguments commonly advanced for atheism aren't as strong as the problem of evil. One argument commonly advanced, one of the most popular in pop culture, is the God of the gaps argument. It goes something like this, and it's usually lightning. Ancient people used to believe that lightning comes from the gods. Those ancient people knew nothing about how this world works. They're so stupid. Why are you following their beliefs? So this is logically invalid. Just because someone's wrong about something doesn't have any bearing on whether other positions they hold are true. But more importantly, it totally misunderstands the case for theism. We don't argue for a God of the gaps. We argue based on what we know. We look at the world, we see that it's highly designed. We argue that that means there's a creator. We look at the world, we see that all human beings have, or nearly all human beings have, a moral compass. That suggests that there is a moral lawgiver, and so forth. Our case is based on the evidence. It's not based on the gaps. But ironically, the case for atheism often is what I call science of the gaps, where they say, oh, well, it looks really, really improbable that the world would be the way it is right now, but someday we'll discover some evidence, some reason to explain why it's so finely tuned, that kind of thing. So who exactly is the blind faith in this equation? I don't think it's the Christian. Another common argument, very common, is that you're only a Christian because you were born in a Christian country to a Christian family. And that might be part of the reason why you are a Christian. But they'll say, if you're born in India, you'd probably be a Hindu. Maybe if I was born in India, I would be a Hindu. But this is also logically invalid. The reason you hold a position has no bearing on the truth of that position. How I came to believe that Christianity is the truth doesn't determine whether it is or not. And in addition to being logically invalid, it's also quite stupid, quite silly. Imagine telling someone that you only believe in a heliocentric solar system because you're born today. If you were born some other time, you would believe in a geocentric solar system. Therefore, you should give up your belief in a heliocentric solar system. The case for Christianity is based on evidence, not why some Christians may hold that position. And in addition, lots of people do change their beliefs. Lots of people, myself included, change their theological beliefs over time, including, ironically, most of those atheists saying the only reason that you are a theist is because you were born into it. Now, alternatively, same kind of idea, but kind of flipping the coin, other atheists will say, well, we were all born atheists. Not true, right? A baby doesn't actually have a position. But I say, fine, you want to have the position of a newborn, barely thinking baby? I agree. That's your position. You have the position of a baby. Congratulations. Another argument that atheists will make is that there's many failed gods. There was many gods of the ancient world. There was thousands and thousands of gods, and they have all failed. They've all disappeared. You're an atheist about Zeus. I'm an atheist about Zeus. We're all atheists about Zeus. The only difference between us is that I believe in one less God than you do. So you're basically an atheist already. Now, again, logically invalid argument. And indeed, if theism is true, if Christianity is true, that's exactly what we would expect. We would expect that all of these other gods would fail, that they would disappear, because they're not real. They are fake things of people's imagination, or possibly demons masquerading as gods, but they aren't the true creator. And strictly speaking, only one religion can be true, or atheism, right? Atheism could be true, but only one religion can be true. So why exactly is it evidence for atheism that many religions have proven false? It isn't, of course. And then also, where's the positive evidence for Zeus or Islam or whatever else you believe? I regularly have discussions with Muslims. I ask them what their evidence for Islam is. They've almost never even attempt to give me any evidence, because their position isn't based on evidence. It's based on belief. Just like the atheist, who doesn't have, usually, any good reasons. They just say they've come to some reason why they think Christianity is false, and then they've transferred that to somehow be evidence that atheism is true. They'll sometimes phrase this differently. Well, what about the tooth fairy and Santa Claus? Isn't your belief in God just kind of the same thing? And this really reveals the difference, right? This reveals the difference between a religious belief, our case for Christianity, and what the atheist is trying to stereotype. Because no one goes around and actually thinks that the tooth fairy is real, other than, a small child who has been told by their parents that they are. No one, when the story was invented, whenever it was invented, the person who invented it knew it's false. They never expected people to believe it was true. They never acted like it was true. It was just a fun game, if you will, to play with children. So that there's not an analogy at all between the tooth fairy and belief in God, because the situation is totally different. So those are the most common arguments given for atheism. There are other arguments. There are perhaps better intellectual arguments, but those are the ones that most atheists will bring up. But what about that normal atheist, right, from my original picture, the one who doesn't really have strong reasons? They're just kind of disinterested. Well, the most common reason that people end up rejecting Christianity or rejecting religion is is not because of any good evidence for their position. It's not for really any good evidence against the theistic perspective or the Christian perspective. Now, often after they've made the choice, right, after they've made the choice to reject Christianity, then they'll go back and try to fill in evidence. They'll Google it up. They'll go to some website. It says 1,001 contradictions in the Bible. They'll look at 2 of them, and I'm like, oh, yep, I made the right choice, right? And those lists are utter garbage, right? If you take any time and you look at them, you'll quickly see that they are taking verses out of context. They're playing games. There's probably only like maybe 20 things that really require an explanation beyond just reading the passage. But what the real reason that people usually reject religion is because of the problem of evil in one form or another. A personal tragedy in their lives, someone they care about died young, that kind of thing, or because of hypocrisy in the church. There's lots of religious people, lots of people who claim to be religious, and they don't seem to be very good. They seem to do a lot of wrong things. A new argument that has become quite popular in recent years to support atheism is no longer that the Bible is untrue. It's no longer that Christianity is false, that there's not sufficient evidence for God or anything along those lines, but rather it's, let's pretend that this God is true. Well, that God's really evil. I don't want to follow that God, so I don't care whether he's true or not. Now, from a logical perspective, the same problem arises, right? As suffering in general, as the strong form of the problem of evil. That atheism, that the rejection of religious belief, if we just want to say agnosticism now, that there's no coherent way to define good and evil. You have to make an assumption that's unjustified. Maybe you start your system by assuming that human beings have intrinsic value, and anything that harms another human being is therefore evil. Well, where did you get the idea that human beings have intrinsic value? Surely it wasn't from science. There's nothing in science that's going to tell you that human beings have value. So it suffers the same problem from a logical perspective. But there is something to be answered here, because we're not looking at the world. We're not making our decisions based on logic. We're making our decisions often based on our emotions. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I'm not saying that that is like a horrific thing. This is how human beings are wired. This is how we were designed by God, to be emotional beings, to live in relationship to one another. So when we do encounter suffering, when we do encounter evil, there is something to be answered. So let's go ahead and try to answer that. So I'll look at 2 things. I'll look at the accusation of hypocrites in the church, hypocrites in the religious faith, that line you hear today, that if we just got rid of religion, we'd have a lot better world, everyone would just get along, because we always fight about religion. And then I'll look at accusations against the biblical God being evil. So first of all, we need to face reality, and that's that these claims are usually grossly exaggerated. They've come up with ridiculous figures to try to justify their claims. There was a claim on a supposedly scholastic Islamic website where the author claimed that during the Inquisition between 50 and 68 million people were killed. Now that number is way out of line with what people will normally say, but people will normally say 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, something along those lines. That the Inquisition, which lasted hundreds of years, was a plague on humanity, and it was all motivated by religion. Well, Henry Common, a scholar who is one of the leading experts on the Spanish Inquisition, he went through all the data. He went through the primary sources. He tried to figure out what the real number was. And he concluded as following: we can in all probability accept the estimate made on the basis of the available documentation that the maximum of 3,000 persons may have suffered death during the entire history of the tribunal. So I'm not saying that the Inquisition is right. I'm not saying that people didn't err and put people to death unnecessarily. But we need to look at the actual reality of the situation, and that's that about 3,000 people over a period of several hundred years were put to death in the name of Christianity. Quite a different thing than what the atheists will often claim. Another figure commonly thrown around is that 9 million people were executed in the witch trials, in the hysteria that broke out in the late Middle Ages, where they were looking for witches everywhere. However, the real number according to experts who've analyzed this, is probably about 50,000. Now, 50,000 is still a lot, right? I'm not saying that those 50,000 lives don't matter, but if you have to exaggerate the numbers to make your case, then you're kind of in a bad situation. Why do you have to exaggerate your numbers to make your case? Why can't you just use the real number? And that's because you're trying to create emotional impact. You're trying to make it look like religion is the source of evil, when in reality, the source of evil is the human heart. That the solution isn't to get rid of religion. The solution is the gospel, to reform our hearts, to have God enter into the equation and make us a better person. But the rejecter of religion wants to act like religion's the problem because they are enemies of God, because they've rejected God. Another thing you'll hear is that almost all war in human history has been caused by religion, that the Christians were killing the other Christians of different sects, that the Christians and Muslims were fighting one another, that Hindus were killing people, and so on and so forth. If you look at the actual data, a book called, I think it's called like the Big Book of War or something, silly title, but it looked at the 500 largest wars in human history. And 95% of those wars are not religious. They're political. They're about territory. They are about conquest. They're about having stuff. In other words, they're about human greed, human sin, and hatred of one another, and not about religion. Of those remaining 5%, more than half are from one religion, Islam. So you're down to 1%, maybe 2% for being extremely generous, that have been caused by Christianity. And when anyone says that they're against religion, that religious causes problems, they always really mean Christianity in the back of their mind, at least here in the West, where the main options are Christianity or atheism. They're not really opposed to Islam or Buddhism or whatever. They're opposed to Christianity. They think that somehow Christianity has caused all these problems. Meanwhile, again, I'm not saying that the people who died at the sins of sinful Christians who were doing wrong things don't matter. I'm just saying we need to face reality here. So meanwhile, the atheist regimes in Russia, China, Cambodia, and so on killed more than all of the Christian wars and all of the Christian governments and all of human history combined in a period of about 50 years. So the track record of atheism doesn't seem to exactly show that it's just all peace and love once you get rid of religion. Another argument that's commonly advanced, especially by Muslims who are feeling guilty about what their prophet may have done, will say there are so many child predators in the church. The scandal of the Catholic Church where they were covering up priests who were abusing children. And that's a horrific situation. I don't deny that, right? It's a horrific situation anytime any child is abused for any reason. However, the reality of the situation is that most abuse of child comes from one of two sources. It comes from a family member or a family friend, a close family friend that is like a family member. That you have to be in a position of trust in order to get access to the child in the first place. So if someone is inclined to abuse children, they're going to be looking for children of people they know. And then additionally, if you're just looking about strangers, which again is only a tiny percentage of the total, you're much more likely to be abused in a public school by a teacher than by a priest in a Catholic church. Now, why do we never hear about children being abused in school? Because it's not really about there being a massive scandal in the Catholic Church. We're talking about 50, 100 priests, whatever number, who abuse children out of thousands and thousands and thousands of priests. It's a very tiny percentage. But when you can point to religion, you can point to something that looks Christian, and you can say they abused children, well, then you can feel better about yourself. You can feel better about your rejection of religion. And incidentally, child abuse is extremely common in Islamic situations, and it doesn't get called out. It's just accepted as part of life. Historically, it was almost a coming of a rite of passage that a male child would be abused by an older male authority figure to make them an adult. And finally, evil is actually the expectation in the Bible. Specifically, evil caused by human beings. Sin, in other words, is the expectation of the Bible. But here's the thing. Unlike atheism, right? Unlike anything else, Christianity offers a solution. This isn't the end of the story. Evil doesn't win in the end. If you're an atheist, you can look at the world and say that there is evil. I mean, you're not being logically consistent, but you can at least say there's things that I don't like, there's suffering, there's no hope, right? It's going to always be that way. It's not the end of the story in the Bible. In the Bible, God enters into the equation and solves the problem. And then in the final days, he comes and eliminates evil once and for all. But what about this accusation that the God of the Bible is evil, that Yahweh is evil? Usually boils down to three things. People might bring other things, but it's usually going to be one of these three. The conquest of Canaan, the doctrine of atonement, or hell. So let's look at the conquest of Canaan. So first you have to understand the historical background here. It's not just arbitrary. God doesn't just say, go slaughter those people because they're unbelievers, like a certain other God might do. But rather, there's a history. There's a long history here. A history of sin and rebellion, of warning, of opportunities to turn. You read through the biblical narrative. It describes a lot of bad things. People who don't understand the biblical narrative, they might look at it and say that this is confusing. It's teaching all kinds of evil things. But when you look at, and oftentimes, right, oftentimes when people do something bad, there's no immediate consequence to it. But when you look at the narrative, you see that these have long-term consequences. The people that inhabited Canaan all descend from sinful actions taken in the early generations of humanity. And then they continue to perpetuate that sin, doing all kinds of horrific acts. Then we have to consider who has the right to end a human life. It's one thing if I go out and I kill someone. It's another thing, regardless of your position on the death penalty, it's another thing if the state does it after a trial, right? They conclude that this person has done something that is worthy of death, and they put that person to death. In my earlier days, I worked in a big box store, and part of the orientation, they talk about shoplifting, right? They talk about people taking stuff off the shelf. And the security guard made a great comment. He said, I will arrest anyone, I don't care, if it's a child, a woman, a disabled person, whatever, unless it's the owner of the store. He comes in, he takes something off the shelf, I let him walk out the store because it belongs to him. And our lives belong to God, so he has the right to take them at any time. Finally, we have to also consider that the Bible is a literary work. It uses language consistent with what people would expect, and thus it's using the stereotypical language of the time, exaggeration of war. We can kind of see this in modern times, right? We can say that my sports team annihilated that team. They completely destroyed them. They killed them. Does that mean that they were totally destroyed? That they'll never play another game of basketball in their lives? That people are dead on the court? Of course it doesn't. It's exaggerated language. And we can see this from the Bible itself. God will make a command, go out to this group, kill all the men, all the women, all the children, sometimes all the animals, all the donkeys, everything. And then the Bible will say, and they did. They went out and they killed all the men and all the women and all the children, and nothing was left. There was nothing in the whole land left. And then a couple chapters later, the same people group is there. So we can see from the narrative itself that it's using this exaggerated language to say that they are completely defeated, that their political standing was destroyed, but it doesn't actually mean that genocide was committed, that everyone was wiped out based on their ethnicity. What about the doctrine of atonement? This is one that comes up both from atheists and Muslims. They say that it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense for Jesus to take the sins of the world upon himself and forgive them. Surely people should be accountable for their own sins. Now we can see even in human laws, in human encounterings, that there are things that one can atone for another, so to speak. I owe a large debt. I made some bad choices. I ran up a bunch of credit cards. I am in big trouble, right? Someone else might step in. Someone who loves me, someone who cares about me. They might pay back that debt. All the penalties are gone, right? There is no further consequences. It has been repaid. Now you'd say, well, okay, but that's just money, right? What about if I kill someone? Can someone stand in for me? Can someone atone for me? And no, because the thing you took is too valuable. No one can stand in your place. No human being, I should say. No human being can stand in your place. But then we have to ask, as we develop, we have to ask the question, who is responsible for our sin? Well, of course I am responsible every time I sin. Any honest person will say that they are responsible. However, that doesn't mean I'm solely responsible. Other people may have encouraged me to do the sin. Other people may have, say my parents, they didn't raise me very well. They gave me bad advice. They told me to do wrong things. There are circumstances that might mean other people have some of the responsibility. Well, what about God? He chose to create us. He chose to bring us into existence, even though he knew we would rebel, knew that we would sin. He doesn't have any moral culpability for our actions, yet he does have some responsibility. He chose to create anyway. So why can't he participate in the act of atonement, the act of making up for those sins? I, God, chose to create you. I knew you would rebel against me. I knew you would do evil things. But I loved you enough to create you anyway. And I loved you enough to provide a solution that you cannot do on your own. No matter how much good you do, you cannot eliminate the evil you do. You're 99% good, not that anyone is. You're 99% good. There's still that 1% of bad that you did. It doesn't go away just because you did a bunch of good deeds. But God can say, I accept that responsibility. I take it on myself. I will pay the penalty for your sins. Your guilt is removed. Finally, a question that's sometimes asked is, couldn't it be done in another way? So we have here Jesus praying like a Muslim, as you can see, prostrate in the Garden of Gethsemane. Obviously nothing actually like a Muslim, but they'll say that that passage is Jesus praying like a Muslim. You can see the grief on his face. You can see the burden that he is bearing. Could it be done in a different way? Could God just say, I forgive you of all your sins? Maybe. It does compromise the justice of God. I'm not omniscient. I don't know every possible way God could have done it. But I do know that he chose the best way he could do it, the most effective way he could do it. He chose a way that demonstrates, first and foremost, his love for us. He takes our sins, he takes the burden, he suffers himself for what we should be suffering for. He demonstrates his love. That is the most important aspect of the way he chooses to atone for our sins. Could he just wave his hand and say they're forgiven? I don't know. But this is the most effective way. This is the way that best gives us what God wants us to know, and that's that he desires a relationship with us, that he values us so much that he would give everything for us. Finally, what about the doctrine of hell? Now, people will say hell doesn't make any sense, that it's not just, but it really boils down to I don't like it. But then also, I kind of do like it, because I don't like it when it applies to me. I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to burn. When they say, well, what about Stalin? He reportedly was shaking his fist at God, cursing God as he was dying after being responsible for millions of people's death. Should he be punished? Well, of course he should. But I'm not as bad as Stalin, right? So people don't necessarily object to hell. They object to the possibility of themselves going to hell. So there are a couple of actual objections to it. And there's kind of three doctrines that are three versions of hell that have been proposed in Christianity over the years. One is universalism, that everyone eventually goes to heaven. The second is the so-called classic doctrine, although all the doctrines or all the proposals have come from ancient times, of eternal conscious torment. And then the final idea is annihilationism, that maybe there's a finite amount of punishment and then you simply cease to exist. So the question is, how can a finite amount of sin lead to eternal punishment? And, well, obviously there's more than one possibility. I don't think that universalism has any scriptural support, but I do think there is reasonable support for annihilationism. So that is an option. I think there's good support for annihilationism, and I think there's good support for eternal punishment. So I think that either one of those is a possibility. But let's just say it's eternal punishment. How can a finite amount of sin lead to eternal punishment? Well, there's two things here. One, what is good and evil, right? What is actually good and what is evil? Well, the classic Christian understanding of good is that God is good. What's evil? Anything that is a perversion of that good, anything that is apart from that. So if God withdraws his protective presence, you're not exactly being punished. It is a consequence of your action. You are in torment. You are suffering from being away from God. But it's not that he's choosing to punish you. It's that you've chosen to reject God, to be apart from him, and now you're suffering the natural consequences of being apart. And additionally, there is the possibility that you continue to reject God. You continue to sin. You continue to create more problems for yourself as you are being tormented. So is eternal torment right? Is annihilationism right? I don't know. But either one is justified. Neither one compromises the Christian position on God.